The town of Halstead had always been a quiet, unremarkable place, tucked away in the rolling hills of the countryside. Its residents lived simple lives, bound by tradition and routine. But beneath the surface, there was an unspoken rule, one that everyone knew but no one dared to break. The rule was simple: never speak of the empty man. He was a figure shrouded in mystery, a ghost story told in hushed whispers by the old-timers to scare the children. The legends said that the empty man was once a man like any other, living in the town many generations ago. But something terrible had happened to him, something that had drained him of his soul, leaving behind only a hollow shell. A man with no face, no voice, and no presence. According to the tales, the empty man would appear to those who were lost, broken, or on the verge of despair. He would come in the dead of night, slipping through the shadows, a figure barely more than a whisper in the dark. Those who saw him were cursed, doomed to a fate worse than death. The empty man would take something from them, something precious and irreplaceable. Their sense of self, their identity, their very essence. They would become like him, hollow and empty, their eyes reflecting nothing but void. For years, the legend of the empty man had been just that, a legend. But all of that changed one cold winter night when he came for Daniel Harper. Daniel had lived in Halstead his entire life. He was a quiet, unassuming man, content to keep to himself and live a solitary existence. He had once been married, but his wife had passed away several years ago, leaving him alone in the small, weathered house they had shared since her death. Daniel had withdrawn from the world, burying himself in his work and avoiding contact with others as much as possible. The night the empty man came for Daniel started like any other. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows and sending chills through the old house. Daniel sat in his favorite armchair by the fire, staring into the flames, his thoughts 1,000 miles away. He had been feeling particularly down that evening, the weight of his loneliness pressing down on him like a physical burden. As the fire crackled and popped, Daniel heard something. A soft, almost imperceptible sound coming from somewhere within the house. It was a faint, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on wood. At first, he thought it was just the wind, but as the sound grew louder, more insistent, he realized it was something else entirely. He stood up, his heart beginning to race as he strained to hear where the sound was coming from. It seemed to be coming from upstairs, from the hallway just outside his bedroom. The tapping continued, steady and deliberate, each knock sending a jolt of fear through Daniel's body. He grabbed the poker from beside the fireplace, clutching it tightly as he made his way to the staircase. The house was dark, the only light coming from the flickering flames behind him. As he climbed the stairs, the tapping grew louder, more urgent, as if something was trying to get his attention, trying to draw him closer. When he reached the top of the stairs, he paused, his breath catching in his throat. The hallway was shrouded in darkness, the shadows deep and impenetrable. The tapping had stopped, leaving an eerie silence in its wake. Daniel stood there for what felt like an eternity, his heart pounding in his chest, before finally mustering the courage to take a step forward. As he moved down the hallway, the floorboards creaked beneath his feet, the sound echoing through the empty house. He reached the door to his bedroom and hesitated, his hand trembling as he reached for the doorknob. The silence was oppressive, pressing in on him from all sides, and he could feel the weight of something watching him, waiting for him to open the door. Finally, he pushed the door open, the hinges groaning in protest. The room was dark, the curtains drawn, and for a moment, Daniel thought there was nothing there. Just an empty room as it had always been. But then he saw it. In the corner of the room, standing in the shadows, was a figure. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs long and thin, almost skeletal. Its face, or what should have been its face, was a featureless void, a blank canvas of pale, lifeless skin. It wore tattered, old-fashioned clothing, the fabric hanging loosely from its emaciated frame. Daniel's breath caught in his throat, a wave of cold fear washing over him as he realized what he was seeing. The figure was the empty man, the very thing he had always dismissed as a myth, a story to frighten children. But here it was, standing in his bedroom, its hollow gaze fixed on him. For a moment, neither of them moved. Daniel was frozen in place, his mind reeling with terror, unable to comprehend what he was seeing. The empty man remained still, a silent sentinel in the darkness, waiting for what Daniel didn't know. Then slowly, the empty man began to move, took a step forward, its movement slow and deliberate, as if it had all the time in the world. Daniel wanted to scream, to run, to do anything to get away, but his body refused to obey. He was rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear as the figure drew closer. The empty man stopped just a few feet away from Daniel, its blank face mere inches from his own. Daniel could feel the cold emanating from its body, a chill that seeped into his bones, freezing him from the inside out. He could hear a low whispering sound, like the rustle of dry leaves. But there were no words, just an unsettling, formless noise that filled his mind. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the empty man reached out and placed its hand on Daniel's chest. The touch was ice cold, a searing pain that shot through his body like a bolt of lightning. Daniel gasped, his vision blurring as the room around him began to spin. He could feel something being pulled from him, something vital and irreplaceable, like a piece of his soul being torn away. His knees buckled, and he collapsed to the floor, the poker slipping from his grasp and clattering to the ground. The empty man loomed over him, its hand still pressed against his chest, draining him of everything that made him who he was. Daniel could feel himself slipping away, his thoughts growing distant and fragmented, his sense of self unraveling like a thread pulled from a seam. He wanted to fight back, to push the empty man away, but he was too weak, too drained. His body felt heavy, numb, as if it no longer belonged to him. He could feel the darkness closing in, a cold, suffocating void that threatened to consume him whole. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the empty man released him. Daniel collapsed to the floor, gasping for breath, his body trembling uncontrollably. The room was spinning, the shadows dancing and swirling around him as he struggled to regain his bearings. When he finally managed to look up, the empty man was gone. The room was empty, as if it had never been there at all. But Daniel knew better. He could still feel the icy chill of its touch, the lingering emptiness in his chest where something vital had once been. He stumbled to his feet, his legs unsteady, and made his way to the mirror that hung on the wall. He needed to see, needed to know if the empty man had taken something from him, as the legend said it would. But when he looked into the mirror, he didn't recognize the face staring back at him. The man in the mirror looked like him. Same features, same hair, same eyes. But there was something wrong, something missing. The eyes that stared back at him were empty, devoid of life, reflecting nothing but a cold, hollow void. The expression on his face was blank, emotionless, as if all the warmth and vitality had been drained away. Daniel's heart sank as he realized what had happened. The empty man had taken more than just a piece of his soul. It had taken his identity, his sense of self. He was nothing more than a shell now, a hollow, empty vessel, just like the legends had warned. Over the next few days, Daniel's condition only worsened. He could feel himself slipping away, his memories growing distant and hazy, his emotions fading into nothingness. He no longer felt joy or sadness, anger or fear, only a cold numbness that filled every corner of his being. The people in town began to notice the change in him. They saw the way he moved slowly and mechanically, like a man who had lost his way. They saw the vacant look in his eyes, the way he no longer seemed to recognize them or respond to their greetings. They whispered among themselves, afraid to get too close, knowing deep down what had happened but too afraid to acknowledge it. They knew the empty man had come for Daniel, just as he had come for others before him. One by one, they began to avoid him, crossing the street when they saw him coming, refusing to meet his gaze. Daniel didn't care. He didn't feel anything anymore. The emptiness had consumed him completely, leaving behind only a hollow shell of the man he once was. Weeks turned into months, and Daniel's condition only deteriorated. He rarely left his house anymore, spending his days sitting in the dark, staring at the walls, his mind a blank, empty void. The townspeople stopped talking about him, stopped thinking about him altogether, as if he had never existed. And then one day Daniel disappeared. No one knew where he had gone or what had happened to him. His house was left exactly as it had been, the fire still burning in the hearth, the poker lying on the floor where he had dropped it. The only thing missing was Daniel himself. The townspeople searched for him, combing the woods and fields around the town, but there was no trace of him to be found. It was as if he had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind nothing but an empty house and a lingering sense of unease. In time, the town moved on, the memory of Daniel Harper fading into obscurity. The old-timers would still tell the story of the empty man from time to time, warning the younger generations to stay away from the dark places, to never let despair take hold of them, lest they too become a victim of the empty man's curse. But deep down, they all knew the truth. The empty man was real, and he would come again one day for someone else. For the empty man was always watching, always waiting, lurking in the shadows, ready to claim another lost soul for his own. And when he did, there would be nothing left behind but an empty shell, a hollow, lifeless husk, and a name that would be forgotten by all who knew it. I had always dreamed of being a radio DJ, and when I finally got the opportunity to host my own show on a late-night station, I was thrilled. WKY was a small local station with a reputation for playing classic hits and late-night talk shows. My show, Midnight Echoes, was a chance for me to share my love for music and connect with listeners during those quiet, solitary hours. The studio was tucked away in a nondescript building on the edge of town, a relic from a bygone era. The equipment was outdated, and the decor was stuck in the 1980s, but it had a certain charm that made it feel like a second home. I spent countless nights there, curating playlists, reading listener requests, and sharing my thoughts with the small but dedicated audience that tuned in. It was on my last night at WKY that things took a turn for the bizarre. I was preparing for my final broadcast before moving on to a new job in a different city. The station had been kind enough to let me have a send-off show, and I was excited to give my listeners one final night of great music and personal anecdotes. As the clock ticked closer to midnight, I went through my routine, selecting songs and checking the sound levels. The studio was quiet, the only sound coming from the hum of the old equipment and the occasional crackle from the speakers. I felt a twinge of nostalgia as I prepared to say goodbye to a place that had become a significant part of my life. Just before the show was set to start, I noticed something strange. The studio's old reel-to-reel tape machine, which hadn't been used in years, was running. I didn't remember turning it on, and the reel was spinning rapidly, the tape feeding through the machine with disconcerting speed. Curious, I approached the machine to investigate, but as I got closer, the tape suddenly stopped. A chill ran down my spine as I realized that the tape wasn't blank. It was filled with what appeared to be distorted audio recordings. I could barely make out snippets of voices and static, but the sounds were garbled and eerie. I tried to rewind the tape, but it seemed stuck, and the more I fiddled with the controls, the more the equipment seemed to resist. Brushing off the unsettling feeling, I decided to go ahead with the broadcast. I started the show, my voice calm and steady as I introduced the first song. The playlist was a mix of classic rock and pop hits chosen to create a relaxed and nostalgic atmosphere for my final night on air. As the show progressed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The studio seemed colder, and I noticed the lights flickering occasionally, casting strange shadows across the room. The static from the tape machine had become more pronounced, a low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to linger in the background. I began receiving odd requests from listeners. Requests for songs I'd never played and messages that seemed cryptic and unsettling. One listener asked for a song to remember the ones who never left, and another requested a track for those who are lost in the static. The messages were vague and eerie, but I tried to keep the mood light, playing the songs and reading the requests as if nothing was wrong. It was during a commercial break that I noticed something truly disturbing. The studio's old console, which had been silent for years, started to crackle and emit faint, disjointed voices. The voices were indistinguishable, overlapping and merging into an unintelligible murmur that sent shivers down my spine. I tried to adjust the controls, but the interference persisted, growing louder and more insistent. I glanced at the reel-to-reel tape machine, which had started to move on its own again. The tape spun rapidly, and the garbled voices became more coherent, though still indistinct. I was unable to comprehend the words, but the sense of dread was palpable. It was as if the machine was trying to communicate something dark and malevolent. My nerves were on edge, and I struggled to maintain my composure as I returned to the broadcast. I spoke into the microphone, my voice trembling slightly, and tried to focus on the music, but the studio was becoming increasingly chaotic. The lights flickered more violently, and the static from the tape machine grew louder, almost drowning out the music. Just before the final hour of the show, I heard a loud, abrupt thud coming from the equipment room. I froze, my heart racing, and slowly walked to the door. The room was dark and cluttered with old equipment, and as I entered, I saw that the tape machine had stopped spinning. The tape was now hanging loosely, and the room was filled with an oppressive silence. I approached the tape machine, and to my horror, I saw that the tape had been rewound to a specific point. The recording had started again, and the distorted voices were now unmistakably clear. They were chanting something, a repetitive, rhythmic incantation that seemed to resonate with dark energy. The words were incomprehensible but filled with a sense of foreboding. As I watched in a mixture of fear and fascination, the voices began to change. They became more coherent, and I could make out a phrase repeated over and over. "Join us in the static." The chant grew louder, filling the room with a chilling resonance that seemed to pulse with a life of its own. I stumbled back from the tape machine, my mind reeling. The oppressive atmosphere in the studio was suffocating, and I felt as though I was being drawn into the darkness. The voices from the tape seemed to echo in my mind, their chant relentless and hypnotic. I had to finish the broadcast, but as I returned to the studio, I noticed that the equipment was malfunctioning. The lights were flickering uncontrollably, and the static from the speakers had reached an almost unbearable level. The studio was filled with an eerie, otherworldly hum that seemed to resonate with the voices from the tape. In a desperate attempt to end the broadcast, I turned off the microphone and tried to shut down the equipment, but the controls were unresponsive, and the studio seemed to be alive with a dark, pulsating energy. The chanting from the tape machine grew louder, its rhythm merging with the static and creating a cacophony of sound that threatened to overwhelm me. With a final surge of determination, I managed to cut the power and silence the equipment. The studio was plunged into darkness, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted slightly. I sat in the silence, my heart pounding and my breath coming in ragged gasps. The tape machine had stopped, and the room was filled with a disconcerting calm. The final broadcast was my last night at WKY, and I never returned to the station. The experience left me shaken, and I couldn't explain what had happened. The reel-to-reel tape machine was left behind, a silent reminder of the dark presence that had infiltrated my show. I tried to find answers, but the more I learned, the more I realized that some things are best left unexplained. In the end, the studio at WKY became a place of dark memories, a chapter in my life that I would never fully understand. The final broadcast was more than just a farewell. It was a confrontation with something beyond our reality, a reminder that the static and shadows can hold secrets too terrifying to comprehend. My grandparents' old farmhouse had always been a place of comfort and nostalgia. It sat on the edge of a small rural town, surrounded by fields and overgrown hedges. The house had been in the family for generations, and each visit was a trip back in time filled with cherished memories. It was the kind of place where every creak of the floorboards and every dusty corner seemed to hold a story. However, the last time I visited, things were different. My grandparents had passed away, and the house had been left to me. I had decided to spend a few weeks there to clear out their belongings and prepare the house for sale. It was a bittersweet task, filled with both fond memories and a deep sense of loss. One afternoon, as I was sorting through the attic, I stumbled upon an old wooden piano. It was covered in a thick layer of dust, and the keys were yellowed and cracked. I hadn't known that my grandparents had a piano, and it seemed out of place among the old trunks and forgotten toys. Curiosity got the better of me, and I decided to clean it up and see if it still worked. After hours of dusting and tuning, I finally managed to get the piano into a playable condition. I sat down at the bench and hesitantly pressed a few keys. The sound that emerged was rusty and off-key, but it was unmistakably a piano's melody. I chuckled at the nostalgic feeling it evoked, but there was something eerie about the old instrument. As the days went by, I found myself drawn to the piano more and more. I would play simple tunes and try to restore some semblance of harmony to its once beautiful sound. Despite the occasional dissonant note, there was a haunting quality to the melodies that seemed to resonate with the house's atmosphere. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and cast long shadows across the room, I decided to play a piece I remembered from my childhood. It was a lullaby that my grandmother used to play for me, and I hoped it would bring back some fond memories. As I played, I noticed something peculiar. The melody seemed to take on a life of its own, shifting and warping in ways that were not typical of the piano's condition. The notes were hauntingly familiar but subtly different, as if the music was trying to communicate something beyond mere melody. The longer I played, the more the air around me seemed to grow colder. I could see my breath misting in the dim light, and the shadows in the room seemed to grow darker and more pronounced. The piano's sound became more ethereal, and the lullaby I was playing began to twist into a dissonant, eerie version of itself. It was then that I heard it. An additional layer of sound, a soft, ghostly harmony that was not coming from the piano itself. It was as if someone or something was singing along with me, their voice melding with the music in a way that was both beautiful and unsettling. The ghostly harmony was faint but persistent, and it seemed to follow the changes in the melody. I stopped playing abruptly, my fingers hovering above the keys. The room fell into a heavy silence, broken only by the distant creak of the house settling. I glanced around the attic, but there was no one else there. I was alone, yet the feeling of being watched was palpable. That night, I struggled to sleep. The image of the piano and the ghostly voice lingered in my mind, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to investigate further, hoping to find an explanation for the eerie occurrences. The next day, I went through old family records and letters, searching for any mention of the piano or its history. I found a collection of letters written by my grandmother detailing her life and the stories behind some of the household items. One letter mentioned that the piano had been a gift from a distant relative who had passed away under mysterious circumstances. According to the letter, the relative had been a musician with a reputation for composing hauntingly beautiful music. It was said that his compositions had an otherworldly quality, and there were rumors that he had a connection to the supernatural. The letter hinted that the piano had been imbued with a touch of his enigmatic spirit. As I read the letter, a chill ran down my spine. The idea that the piano might be connected to something supernatural was both intriguing and terrifying. I decided to return to the attic and play the piano once more, hoping to uncover more about its mysterious past. That evening, I sat down at the piano and began to play the haunting lullaby again. As the melody filled the room, I felt a presence surrounding me. The air grew colder, and the ghostly harmony reappeared, blending seamlessly with the music. The voice was clearer this time, a soft, sorrowful whisper that seemed to convey a deep sense of longing and melancholy. The melody continued to warp and shift, and I could sense an emotional weight behind the music. It was as if the piano was trying to convey a message or tell a story through its haunting notes. I played on, feeling a growing connection to the piano and the enigmatic spirit it seemed to harbor. Hours passed, and I lost track of time as I played. The music became a conduit for my emotions, and I found myself lost in the haunting beauty of the melodies. The ghostly voice grew fainter, and the room began to feel warmer as I played. Eventually, I stopped playing and sat in silence, the piano's final notes fading away. The atmosphere in the attic felt lighter, and the oppressive feeling that had lingered seemed to dissipate. I felt a sense of peace, as if the piano had shared its sorrow and allowed me to connect with the spirit of my distant relative. The following day, I made arrangements to have the piano restored and donated to a local museum, where its history and haunting melodies could be appreciated by others. The museum curator was fascinated by the piano's story and agreed to display it with an explanation of its mysterious past. As I prepared to leave the farmhouse for the last time, I took one final look at the attic and the piano. The experience had been both unsettling and profoundly moving. I felt a sense of closure, knowing that the piano's story and the spirit behind it would continue to live on in a place where others could appreciate its beauty and mystery. The haunting melody of the piano stayed with me long after I left the farmhouse. It was a reminder of the invisible threads that connect us to the past and the ways in which music can bridge the gap between the living and the dead. The piano had been a vessel for a message from beyond, and its legacy would continue to resonate with those who encountered its haunting melodies.